like the book of Job, but most of the time when I study it, I study the first couple of chapters and the last couple of chapters. And here lately, from time to time, I go and I try to read through some of the chapters in the middle. And most of the time, I've ended up on a chapter where the friends are arguing with Job. And they don't have a lot of good stuff to say, so sometimes I skip some of those parts. But then sometimes his response to the adversity is wonderful, and that's one of the sections that we see here. Job 29 is a continuation of something he's been dealing with. But tonight I wanted to talk about the good old days. We like to think of the good old, sometimes the good old days weren't so good. Sometimes they were the best times of our life because we were young and didn't have to pay electric bills and go to work and all that stuff. Starting in verse 1 down through verse 17. Moreover, Job continued his parable and said, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness. As I was in the days of my youth, when the secret of God was upon my tabernacle, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me. When I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured me out rivers of oil. When I went out to the gate through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street. The young men saw me and hid themselves, and the aged arose and stood up. The princes refrained talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The nobles held their peace, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard me, then it blessed me, and when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. Because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My judgment was as a robe and a diadem. I was eyes to the blind, and feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not, I searched out. And I break the jaws of the wicked, and pluck the spoil out of his teeth." Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, this evening as we look into your word, we are grateful for the opportunity to have it, to appreciate it, to study it, and to learn from it. And sometimes we look back and we think our best days are behind us without considering what you're trying to do in our lives right now. And if we understand that you are always good and you are always great and you are always trying to improve us and conform us to the image of your Son, then whatever you're doing in our life, whether it seems like it's better than something we had before, it is for our good and it is for your glory. And so I trust that we would learn to appreciate in Jesus' name. Amen. Job constantly is being challenged throughout the middle part of the book about all the things that are going on here. But if you go down through this section, you can divide different aspects that you often hear people talk about that they cherish. And yet, there's interesting things that we can learn here. The first thing is in verses 1 through 3. In the good old days, sometimes we think God's guidance and protection was better at a certain time than it was now. And that happens from time to time because we're in the middle of a trial and we feel closer to Him. He tends to give us what we need when we need it. But you see here that Job is relishing in the fact that he was preserved of God. "Oh, that I were in the months past, as in the days when God preserved me." Now, humanly speaking, We can look at Job's life and say, well, he lost everything, so that's true. God was preserving him when he was rich and when he was powerful and when he was honorable and when he was serving all these people and he was respected. But now that he has nothing and his health is in question and his friends are all challenging him, it doesn't seem like God is preserving him. But the warning here, and I think Job is saying this as well, I would love to return back to those days, but I just don't understand what God's doing with my life right now. It seemed like he was blessing me when I was comfortable, when I was healthy, when I was a pillar of the community. But think about this thought. All of the accusations and all of the hard speeches that his friends make against him are because of the trials that he's going through. If you can remember that when you read through the book of Job, the only thing that has changed in Job's life is stuff. That's it. And his health. Nothing has changed about his character. So as we continue reading down through this chapter, we're going to see, I wish I were back in the days when people thought of me this way and they treated me this way and they did all this. But you have to remember that nothing changed about his character. He is the exact same person. He is just viewed differently. And there's a lesson in and of itself. Because sometimes in the middle of a trial, we have a tendency to think, I don't know what that person did that they're dealing with this problem or that problem or the other problem. Job didn't do anything. In fact, throughout the book, God reminds us a couple of times, Job did all this stuff, or he said all this stuff, but he sinned not. He never changed his character. He never deteriorated who he was. God was trying to do something great through him, but it didn't feel the same to Job. The word preserved means to be hedged about, to observe someone, to regard them. Now, if you think about this from Job's perspective, he has lost all his stuff, he's lost his kids, house fell in, and now his health is deteriorated. And it's easy to look at the situation and to think, well, God isn't really preserving me. But we know the whole story from God's perspective, because he tells us that Satan goes up to visit and God says, okay, you can do this to him, but you can't touch him. And so he takes all the stuff away. And for us, that's a huge challenge, but we know that the hedge of protection was still there because God told Satan he couldn't touch him. And then he goes, and they have the second conversation. Well, as long as he's healthy, there's no reason to challenge you. Okay, you can afflict him, but you can't take his life. And again, in the midst of the boils and all the pain and the agony and the problems that are going on, it doesn't seem like the hedge of protection is there. And yet from the perspective we have through the Holy Spirit, we know that it was still there. Important lesson for us to remember. He uses a lot of unique language here to describe. It's very colorful, it's very beautiful, almost poetic in a lot of the things that he says. Verse 3, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness. A candle upon my head shows the favor and the blessing. I was reading about this statement because I thought, why would you shine a candle on somebody's head? It'd be easier to see if the candle was out in front of you. But it makes sense. You go back and you look at like old Egyptian art and stuff, they usually picture a light above the person's head. It was supposed to be that their God, whoever it may be in their society, was blessing their king or their ruler. And that's the picture that he gives here. It was supposed to bring comfort to the person, the ability to see clearly and to discern and to know that they were blessed by God. And then they walked by his light through difficulties. All of the other uncertain times, and I'm sure Job had his portion of uncertain times in his life. This is the only one that's recorded for us. But the guidance of God in living life properly until he gets to this point. And you have to think of how many difficult times Job went through that we know nothing about, because it's all pre the point where Satan goes up and God says to him, have you considered my servant Job? Listen, if he hasn't been through trials and testing, and if he hasn't come out on the other side of it, a shining example, there's no sitting there telling Satan, you should look at Job, because he's an excellent example of. How can you be an excellent example of something if you've never been through it? Then you get to verse 4. As I was in the days of my youth. Listen, the knees start hurting, the back starts hurting, you can't run as fast, can't keep up with the kids or the grandkids like you used to be able to. You're hauling sleds up and down the snow, and you're running out of wind faster than you used to. And you think, man, when I was a young person, I could hit the top of that hill and never stop. That's the kind of the thought here. In the days of my youth, in the former days, when I look back and I felt like I was flourishing, when I felt strong and vibrant and healthy. And it's amazing what you could do before you were even tired. If I went out on a pond right now and started skating to play hockey, I'd probably be half dead in about an hour. And you think back, when I was a kid, I'd come home from school, lace up my skates, I'd shovel the pond off. 5-6 inches of snow, you had to clear the pond before you could skate on it. Get it all done, take a break, drink a little bit of water, and then play hockey until it was dark. Turn the lights on the truck and play until Mom and Dad were like, get off the pond, man, you got to go to bed. And you get up the next morning, jump out of bed, go to school, and it wasn't like you were sore all over and thought you were going to die. You did that now, you couldn't make it to school. They couldn't drag you there with a tow truck. We look back at those times and we think, man, those were the best times. Well, maybe not. Maybe what God's doing with you right now is much more important than anything he was ever able to do with you in your youth. And he keeps on going. When the secret of God was upon my tabernacle. The servant of God, there was a special personal bond with God. I don't know if you've ever felt any of those times. There have been several times like that in my life. I remember my dad took me one time to an all-night prayer meeting. And for the life of me, I knew it was coming. It was a Friday night to a Saturday morning. We were going to stay up all night long and pray. Pastor kept telling me there'd be cookies, and we were going to break up and pray about this and pray about that and pray about that. And I kept thinking, how in the world can you pray for 8 hours? I mean, it just seems impossible. And then we'd get in there and they'd talk about missionaries and, this is what this missionary's doing, this is what this missionary's doing, this is what them. Now we're going to take 15 minutes, we're going to pray for him. And by the time 2 or 3 people prayed for that missionary, they were ringing the bell, and it was on to the next missionary, and on to the next missionary, and on to the next missionary, and then different ministries of the church. And next thing you know, in an hour, we were getting ready to go home. And I didn't see anybody nodding off and falling asleep, and I was fairly young. It's one of those times where you went in and you had no idea what the expectation was going to be, and then all of a sudden God works in a way that you were not expecting. But this is more than that, because it's a secret of God. It's when you know a secret, you know something that nobody else knows. And it's that feeling of knowing the mind of God, like your life had purpose. You knew what he was trying to do with you, and you felt special because of it. And Job felt that way in the way that he was serving the Lord. Verse 5, family. I would imagine this has to be a tough thing for Job to think about, losing all of his kids in one day. The death of a loved one is one of the most traumatic events that anybody faces. I don't know how you deal with losing all 7 of the kids. It's unfathomable almost to think about. But what's interesting here is he couples a few different things here. When the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, I had the comfort of God and I had the comfort of family. I was able to spend time with them and enjoy them. I was enjoying what they had become, and the younger ones what they were becoming, and I knew that they were safe, and I knew that they were well, and I knew that all these things. And sometimes, when you get older, it's hard when your kids leave, and we've got one in Tennessee, and sometimes you wonder, is everything okay, and are they doing well, and wish they just lived right down the road so you know every day. And then verse 6, prosperity. And that's what most people think about when they think about Job, his loss of prosperity. When I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured me out rivers of oil. Now what's interesting is he doesn't mention gold and silver, the valuables of the day and the precious stones, because really those things, you can hoard them and you can use them for buying something, but in and of themselves, most of the time you don't enjoy them. But when you think of olive oil and you think of butter, those are two things that you are able to enjoy. And the first one, butter especially, able to support his family. Think of the numerous herds of animals that Job had. They came and stole all these camels, and they came and stole all these sheep, and they came and stole all the donkeys. And when you talk about washing your steps with butter, there's plenty of milk for everyone to drink, and then there's enough left over that you can make butter. And the thought here is, not only is there enough milk for everybody to drink and enough to make butter that would suffice everybody, but you would have enough butter that you had made that if you wanted to, you could wash the steps and clean them off with it. And now think about it. It's not like you go and milk butter out of a cow. And back in this day, there's only one way you milked an animal. You didn't run them into the barn, hook them up to the milker, and sit there for a little while take the milker off, done. Oh, that was nice. No, you had to do it the old-fashioned way, by hand. And when you get as old as I am, the arthritis would start bothering you if you were milking by hand. But think about the effort they put into milking all these animals to feed everybody. But then making butter is an extra because you have to churn it. You put some salt in it, so it took some effort to get the salt. You wouldn't think, unless you had an abundance of it, of taking something that you worked that hard to make and washing your front steps with it. But what he's saying is, God blessed me with such abundance that I could wash all of my steps, because that's how favorable he looked upon me. It's an incredible statement. Enough to be generous with, enough to be creative with, not barely getting by is the point. And then the rocks poured out oil. Well, what do you mean the rocks poured out oil? Well, when we think of farming, we think of the richest, nicest land. You have the breadbasket in the United States. It doesn't encompass the Rocky Mountains, and it doesn't encompass the Appalachians. It's not, those aren't the most fertile places. Can we grow grass around here? Yes. But if you really want to grow grass, I can take you to some places where, they cut 10 times the grass we cut. And that's the concept. The barren, rocky places that you don't think would be productive are growing olive trees that are bountiful in their harvest. And you can eat it, you can use it in lamps, it has healing qualities. Olive oil was a special gift, and it was an important item. And he's talking about it here in abundance. Poured me out rivers of oil. Again, he's saying, I have so much milk and butter, and I have so much olive oil, I don't even hardly know what to do with it. I remember those days. That's how God was blessing him in his prosperity. But then in verses 7-11, he talks about a respected reputation. And these are the things we sometimes don't think about as much as we do the prosperity. When I went out to the gate through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, he had power. Back then, everything was done in the gates to the city. It's the place where business and court were held. And it was done openly right out in front of everybody. And so the first phrase is saying he walked through the city to go to the gate. Now, he's not pomp and circumstance like you think about in the times of Jesus that the Pharisees and the Sadducees would do. What he's simply saying here is Job attended and participated. He thought it was important enough to know what was happening in the city and to be involved with it. And we're going to see that a little bit more later on. But then it goes a step farther because it says he prepared his seat or his area in the avenue. And you say, why would he do that? Well, it's a statement that he was setting up as a judge or a magistrate. So if a judge or a magistrate was going to go and listen to folks, they would go out there and they would set up out there in the street by the gate. They'd sit down, and then folks would come to them to have their judgments done. We see pictures of Moses doing that for the nation of Israel. So Job was obviously an important person. He was a powerful person. He was a judge or a magistrate. And then he goes on here and he tells us how he was regarded in this, because some people are good leaders and they're respected in their community, and other people are just, well, they're leaders, and they probably ought not to be. But in verse 8 it says, the young men saw me and hid themselves. Why? Because he was mean? Oh no, here comes Job. He better get out of here, or he'll be throwing something at us or calling us names or whatever. That is not what it says. There are two thoughts here. The first one is they moved to make room for him. So here you are, you have a busy street, and they see Job walking down the street to go and conduct his business, and the young men would respectfully get out of the way. Ooh, there's Job. Kind of like watching a superstar out in Hollywood, come the people get out of the way and let them go by because they're important. Only Job really was important. The other side of this coin is not only did they move to make room, but there's also a emotional side to this. They're self-conscious in his presence. They hid themselves. In other words, it made them want to withdraw a second. Wow, someday I'd like to be like him. Young people tend to be boisterous. They tend to be outgoing. They tend to be wide open, and they're joking and carrying on. And then Job would walk down the street, and not only would they get out of the way and make room for him to go by, but it would make them contemplate who they were and pull back the reins of the silliness a little bit and go, wow, I wonder if someday I could be like Job. Obviously, this is an impressive individual. Oh, what about the older men? Because the older men are usually the ones who would get reverence and respect. It says, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the aged arose and stood up. They stood in honor and respect. In other words, the statement is, those that were used to being respected were showing it to Job, which means you have folks who other folks looked at and, oh, there's Grandpa, and you treat him a certain way because he's demonstrated that he's wise and that and then all of a sudden you see Grandpa show that respect to somebody else would have an effect on younger people, because they're looking up to this individual, and next thing you know, they see this person looking up to this individual. Well, immediately you would look up to that individual and say, wow, that's somebody that so-and-so really cared about. It's a pretty big statement. And then we get to verse 9, and it says, the princes refrained talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The prince who was a steward or a keeper or a captain. And it's just a statement that they refrained from talking. Sometimes you get in a busy crowd. I don't know if you've ever been to an auction. The auctioneer's up there trying to sell something, and sometimes there's folks in the crowd that aren't interested in whatever the auctioneer's selling, and they're sitting there having their private conversation, and they get loud, and they're carrying on and not paying the least bit of attention to what's going on here because they have no interest in it. But this is a statement they are listening carefully to his wisdom and his judgment. The Bible tells us that folks came from a long ways away to hear Solomon because they were so impressed with his wisdom. And this is the same kind of thought, only Job is before Solomon. I don't know if any of you remember when I was a kid. We didn't watch a lot of TV, so I guess commercials impressed me then. But there'd be crowded street, and two people would be walking down the street, and they'd say, well, what are you going to do about your retirement? Well, my agent is E.F. Hutton, and E.F. Hutton says, and it would get dead quiet. The taxis would stop, the trains would stop, everything. I mean, it'd be like in the middle of New York City, and all of a sudden you could hear a pin drop. And that one guy would turn around and he'd say, I get used to it, because when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. And that was the punchline. Didn't matter what was going on. When E.F. Hutton said something, buddy, you better shut your mouth and listen, because whatever they had to say was important. It's kind of the attitude that we see here with Job. He was known for being a righteous individual and a man of justice, and so they would be quiet and listen because they wanted to hear what he had to say. Then you have the nobles. That's the chief and the leader, the people who are used to authority, the other judges and the magistrates. Sometimes when you have similar authority figures in similar offices, they are vying for power and they're vying for reputation. But the statement here is, in verse 10, the nobles held their peace, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. In other words, they sought his opinion because they valued his wisdom. Rather than being the first one to speak, rather than being the one that has to have something to say and stepping to the center of the room, they realized that time after time after time in Job's judgment and in the way that he dealt with people, it was so masterful and wonderful that rather than be jealous of him, they were trying to learn from him and appreciate him. That's a powerful statement. Last thing we'll go over tonight, verse 11, respect. When the ear heard me, then it blessed me, and when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. Now that's just, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty weird verse until you put it in its context and realize what it's saying. They appreciated the wisdom, and so they prayed for God's blessing on his life. They would see Job and they would watch him as a judge do his thing. And rather than be angry at him, or rather than look at him and say, he's foolish, or he's crazy, or he's whatever, they'd say, that is a smart, caring, concerned man. I hope he is around for a long, long time. I hope my kids get to enjoy the benefit of having Job around. I hope maybe my grandkids get to have the benefit of having a judge or a magistrate like Job around. It's a pretty powerful statement of respect that when you witness the way that he conducted himself and you heard what he had to say, that it brought out the best in you and you would bless him and pray for him. And then it says, and the eye saw. It's not just something that you hear about. From time to time you hear, oh, so-and-so is doing such and such. Or you're sitting there and you watch this beautiful sunset and you grab your phone and you're trying to take a picture of it, and then you look at the picture and say, that just doesn't do it justice. There are a lot of things that in order to get the full magnificence of it, you have to experience it and not hear about it. And that's what it's talking about here. The folks that were able to witness him work personally realized that he was remarkable in person. Hard to fully appreciate unless you experience it. And the only thing that I could think of is, I remember the first time I ever went to Niagara Falls. I had talked to some folks who had been there, and they were like, oh, you got to go down on the hurricane deck on the American side and sit there and have a conversation because you'll remember it for the rest of your life. And we went down there, and Mom and Dad said, anything y'all want to do? And I said, I'd like to go down on the hurricane deck. I've heard it's life-changing. And so they put this little plastic poncho on you for who knows what reason. Seemed foolish at the time, but they put this little plastic poncho on you and you walk down through there, and the falls they recede so many inches every year, so they're back farther than they used to be. But when I was a kid, they would hit right next to the banister on that hurricane deck that they call it. Now it's a couple of feet back, and it's still impressive, but it isn't nearly as impressive as it was. You could stand right there and they would warn you, folks, don't stick anything in the falls, you might lose it. And sure enough, some kid would walk up there and stick his hand in, and bam, it would slap it down on the railing of the banister there, because it's water falling from how many feet above you. And you can't hear anything. And I remember standing there watching the sun go through that water and just looking at it and thinking, if water is this powerful, how do you describe how powerful God is? because this is like one tiny aspect of something that he created. And the whole time I'm sitting there staring at this water, and eventually I turn around and look, my mom and dad are halfway up the ramp and they're hollering at me and waving, and the guide has to come back and tap me on the shoulder. You can't hear somebody, you can put your mouth right to their ear and yell at them, and you can't hear a word. It's easy to tell somebody that. How dark is it in a mind? I know I've asked Dad that before, and I've asked some others in the church that have mining experience. How dark is it in the mind? It's dark. I mean, it doesn't get any darker than that. You can't tell you have your hand in front of your face. Listen, you can try and explain it to somebody, but if you want to really experience it and feel the loneliness of how dark it would be if you turned off all the lights, and the coolness and the clamminess that goes with being in that environment, then you have to be there. And there's nothing that compares to it. Can you imagine folks that sat in the gate someday and listened to Job? Field trip. Let's take the kids from school and we go down to the gate, and there's Job and he's doing his courtroom stuff. Most of the kids on a field trip would be bored out of their gourd and ready to go. But when you read this thing, you got folks who are sitting there with rapt attention going, wow, man, this is an incredibly smart guy. This is better than Judge Judy. The discernment and you're lying. No, I'm not lying. You're lying. The way that they conducted themselves, so well respected and so appreciated. And here we are in the middle of a trial, and nothing has changed about Job himself. But he looks at this and he says, I wish I could go back a couple of months to when. And maybe the reason that he's doing this is a reminder to his friends that really the only thing that has changed in his life is that for some reason God is testing him and took away all of his stuff. But it didn't change anything about Job. Job is still the same man that was that respected. And we haven't even got to the rest of it, where he's taking care of folks and protecting them and providing for them, and stuff that he doesn't have to do, but he willingly does, that tells you why God picked him and told Satan, hey, have you considered my servant Job? Because he is a really righteous individual. Sure, this is a parable, but a parable always is to illustrate a point. And the point is that here we are in whatever situation we're in now, and the tendency is, if it's not accompanied with a lot of physical blessing, then we think that God's missing from it, or it's somehow second rate to something that we had before in our lives. When actually we know that Job's going to get to the end of this experience, and he doesn't say, you have made me more wealthier than I have ever known. He says, no, I have heard about you with the hearing of my ear, but now I have experienced it personally. And that's a whole different category for the relationship that he had with God. Praises or prayer requests.